The desert was still dark when the first engine coughed to life. It was just before dawn on May 26, 1942, somewhere west of Tobruk in the North African desert. The air was cold, sharp, and filled with the smell of oil and sand. Inside a cramped American tank, a young crew waited in silence, listening to the distant rumble of German engines moving in the darkness. They had been told this tank was not respected. They had heard the jokes. Thin armour, weak gun. A machine that could not stand against the Afrika Korps. But in a few hours everything would change, and men under General Erwin Rommel would begin to realise that this American tank was not something to laugh at. At first glance, the tank did not look impressive. It was tall, narrow, and simple. The design felt outdated even when it arrived in the desert, and British crews who first received it in 1941 called it clumsy and exposed. If you want more content like this, subscribe now and comment below. German officers dismissed it after studying early reports. Compared to the heavy German Panzer III and Panzer IV, it seemed like an easy target. It carried a 37mm main gun, a weapon many believed was already too small for modern armoured warfare. The armour was thin in places, and its profile made it visible across open ground. No one expected this tank to become a threat. This machine was the M3 Stuart, known to British forces as the Honey. It had been built in the United States during a time when American industry was still adjusting to the demands of global war. The United States had not yet entered the conflict, but factories were already producing tanks for Allied forces under the Lend-Lease program. The M3 Stuart was never meant to dominate the battlefield alone. It was designed as a fast, mobile tank for reconnaissance and support. Speed was its strength, not brute force. When British units first deployed the Stuart in North Africa in late 1941, they noticed something unusual. The tank was reliable. Its engine performed well in desert heat. Its tracks handled sand better than many earlier British designs. And most important, it moved fast. Faster than most German tanks at the time. Crews quickly learned that speed could be just as deadly as armour. The desert was not like Europe. There were no forests to hide in, no cities to shield movement. Visibility stretched for miles. A tank that could move quickly could control the fight. It could strike and disappear before the enemy reacted. The Stuart was perfect for this kind of war. German commanders, including General Lieutenant Ludwig Cruel and officers within the Afrika Korps, initially saw these tanks as light targets. Reports described them as lightly armoured American machines used by British forces. Some crews called them mobile coffins. Others said their gun could not penetrate German armour at range, but these early judgments were made before facing the tank in full combat conditions. On November 18, 1941, during Operation Crusader, the first large clashes between Stuart tanks and German forces took place near Sidi Rezegh. The desert battlefield was chaotic, filled with dust clouds, artillery bursts, and scattered armoured formations moving across open ground. Stuart units advanced quickly, surprising German reconnaissance elements. Their speed allowed them to outmaneuver slower formations and hit supply vehicles, anti-tank crews, and exposed flanks. German soldiers began reporting that the small American tanks appeared suddenly and fired rapidly before pulling back. The 37mm gun was not powerful against heavy armour at long range, but at close distances it could damage Panzer III tanks and destroy armoured cars. More important, the Stuart carried multiple machine guns that were devastating against infantry positions. The effect was psychological. Crews inside German tanks realised these machines were not meant to fight like heavy armour. They were hunters, moving fast and choosing when to strike. Rommel's forces had built their success on speed and manoeuvre, but now they were facing an enemy that could match them in mobility. As the fighting intensified through late 1941 and early 1942, the Stuart became a regular presence across the desert. British units like the 7th Armoured Division used them aggressively, often pushing ahead of heavier formations. They scouted enemy movements, disrupted supply lines, and forced German units to stay alert at all times. The men inside these tanks were often young and inexperienced. Many had never seen combat before arriving in North Africa, yet they learned quickly. The desert forced adaptation. Crews memorized terrain features, learned how to use dunes as cover, and practiced firing on the move. Communication inside the tank was constant. The commander watched for threats. The driver focused on speed and positioning. The gunner waited for the right moment to fire. You can almost feel the tension inside that cramped steel shell, the engine roaring behind you, sand hitting the hull like rain, the smell of fuel, sweat and dust filling the air. Every movement mattered. One wrong turn could expose the tank to anti-tank guns. 1 second of hesitation could mean being hit first. German tank crews began to respect the Stuart, even if they still considered it lightly armoured. They noticed how quickly it appeared and disappeared. They noticed how it harassed supply convoys and forced them to divert resources. They noticed how it supported British infantry and attacked weak points before heavier tanks arrived. Rommel himself was a master of mobile warfare. He understood the value of speed and surprise. But as the desert campaign dragged on, even his forces struggled to keep supply lines intact. Fuel shortages, mechanical wear, and constant pressure from Allied air and ground units created a fragile situation. Stuart tanks played a role in this pressure, constantly probing and attacking vulnerable areas. On May 27, 1942, during the early stages of the Battle of Gazala, Stuart tanks were again at the front. The battlefield stretched across miles of desert west of Tobruk. German and Italian forces launched a massive offensive aimed at breaking British defensive lines. The fighting was intense and confused. Armoured units clashed in open ground while artillery thundered across the horizon. Stuart crews moved ahead of British formations, scouting enemy movements and engaging lightly defended positions. Their speed allowed them to reach places heavier tanks could not. They struck supply trucks, artillery units, and reconnaissance patrols. German reports from this period mention repeated attacks by fast Allied tanks that disrupted coordination. For German infantry and support units, these attacks were deadly. The Stuart's machine guns cut down exposed troops. Its rapid movement made it hard to track, and its small size compared to heavier tanks allowed it to manoeuvre in tight spaces. Some German tank commanders began instructing crews to stay alert for these fast-moving vehicles. They learned to avoid being isolated. They learned to protect their flanks. The Stuart might not win a head-on fight with a Panzer IV, but it could destroy vehicles caught alone or strike from unexpected angles. Inside Rommel's command structure, the growing presence of Allied light tanks forced adjustments. Reconnaissance units needed better coordination. Anti-tank defences had to be strengthened. The battlefield was no longer dominated by heavy armour alone. Meanwhile, American industry continued producing Stuart tanks in large numbers. By early 1942, factories like American Car and Foundry and Cadillac were producing hundreds each month. These machines were shipped across the Atlantic, unloaded in Egypt, and rushed to the front. Crews sometimes received them only days before entering combat. The desert fighting revealed something important about warfare. Not every tank needed to be heavily armoured to be effective. Mobility, coordination, and timing could be just as powerful. German losses from Stuart encounters were not always dramatic in numbers, but they were constant. Supply trucks destroyed, reconnaissance vehicles ambushed, isolated tanks damaged, crews killed or wounded by sudden attacks. Over time, this pressure wore down Rommel's forces. By mid-1942, during the battles around Tobruk and El Alamein, the Stuart had become a familiar and respected enemy vehicle. German soldiers no longer mocked it. They recognized its role. It was not a heavy breakthrough tank. It was a fast predator. The tank's greatest strength remained its speed. With a top speed that could reach around 36 miles per hour on good terrain, it could reposition quickly. It could chase retreating units. It could escape danger. This mobility allowed it to survive in a battlefield where heavier tanks often became targets. Inside the tank, crews depended on each other completely. The commander made rapid decisions. The driver navigated rough terrain. The gunner adjusted aim with every movement. The communication was constant. Fear was always present, but training and teamwork kept them moving. You can imagine the moment when a Stewart crested a dune and spotted a German supply convoy below. Engines roaring, dust rising, machine guns firing, trucks exploding, German soldiers scrambling for cover. Then the tank pulls away before enemy armour arrives. It was not about holding ground. It was about striking and disappearing. Rommel's crews began reporting increased losses in these kinds of encounters, not always from direct tank battles, but from disruption and harassment. The battlefield became unpredictable. The small American tank could appear anywhere. As the war continued, new German tanks with heavier armour and stronger guns entered service. The Stuart struggled against these machines in direct combat, but its role remained vital. It scouted, it supported, it attacked weak points, and it kept pressure on enemy forces. In July 1942, during the First Battle of El Alamein, Stuart tanks again operated alongside British units, helping hold defensive lines against Rommel's advance. The fighting was intense, with artillery, infantry and armour all clashing across the desert. The Stuart's speed allowed it to move between positions, reinforcing threatened areas and pursuing retreating units. German crews facing these tanks knew they were not facing a weak machine. They were facing a tool used with precision, a tank that played its role perfectly in a larger system. War is rarely decided by a single weapon. It is decided by coordination, logistics, morale, and adaptability. The Stuart became part of that system for Allied forces. It gave them mobility. It gave them reach. It gave them a way to respond quickly. By late 1942, as the tide turned in North Africa, the Stuart continued to serve in reconnaissance and support roles. Heavier American tanks like the M4 Sherman began arriving, bringing stronger armour and guns. But the Stuart did not disappear. It remained in service, trusted by crews who valued its reliability. Rommel's forces, already stretched by supply shortages and constant pressure, faced a battlefield where Allied mobility was growing. Light tanks, armoured cars and aircraft worked together to disrupt movements and isolate units. The Stuart was part of that network. The men who once mocked the tank had learned a lesson. In war, underestimating an enemy weapon can be deadly. The Stuart was not built to dominate. It was built to move, to scout, to strike quickly. And in the hands of determined crews, that was enough. But there was another side to the story that many never saw. Inside the Stuart, the experience of combat was intense and personal. The tank was small compared to later designs. Space was tight. Noise was constant. The engine sat just behind the crew, roaring so loudly that communication often required shouting. Heat built quickly, especially during daytime operations in North Africa. Sweat-soaked uniforms. Dust found its way into every corner. On long patrols, crews stayed alert for hours, scanning the horizon through narrow viewing ports. Every shadow could hide an anti-tank gun. Every ridge could conceal a German Panzer waiting to fire. The desert was wide, but it was never safe. Tank commanders often relied on instinct as much as training. They read the movement of dust clouds to guess enemy direction. They watched the sun's angle to judge distance. They listened for engine sounds carried by the wind. In open desert warfare, awareness meant survival. Many engagements involving Stuart tanks happened at very close range, sometimes less than 500 metres. At that distance, the 37mm gun was effective. It could penetrate lighter armour and damage German vehicles. Gunners learned to aim for weak points, tracks, turret rings, vision ports. Every shot counted. The Stuart also played a key role in supporting infantry. During assaults on fortified positions, it moved alongside advancing soldiers, using its machine guns to suppress enemy defences. This cooperation saved lives. Infantry trusted the tank's presence. The sound of its engine meant support was close. German troops noticed this coordination. Reports from the Afrika Korps described Allied attacks where light tanks moved with infantry and artillery, creating pressure from multiple directions. It became harder to isolate and destroy individual units. As 1942 moved toward its final months, the battlefield began shifting. The Second Battle of El Alamein in October marked a turning point. Allied forces pushed forward with renewed strength, backed by improved supply lines and growing air superiority. Stuart tanks again operated at the front, scouting ahead and protecting flanks as heavier formations advanced. For Rommel's exhausted crews, the pressure was constant. Fuel shortages forced difficult decisions. Units had to retreat quickly or risk being cut off. Fast Allied vehicles, including the Stuart, made these retreats dangerous. They chased columns, attacked stragglers, and forced German forces to stay in motion. You can almost feel the urgency in those moments. A German convoy trying to withdraw under the desert sun. Engines overheating. Dust filling the air. Then sudden movement on the horizon. Fast tanks closing in. Gunfire. Explosions. Chaos. And once again, the small tank that had once been mocked was at the centre of the action. By early 1943, as Axis forces retreated toward Tunisia, the Stuart remained active. It escorted columns, scouted mountain passes, and guarded supply routes. Its role continued to evolve, always tied to speed and mobility. American crews who later received the tank in other theatres, including the Pacific and Europe, carried lessons learned in North Africa. They understood its strengths and weaknesses. But they knew it was not meant for heavy tank duels. It was meant to move fast, gather information, and strike vulnerable targets. The reputation of the Stuart had changed. It was no longer seen as an underpowered machine. It was seen as reliable, fast, and deadly when used correctly. Or even German veterans later admitted that Allied light tanks created constant pressure. They forced movement. They exposed weaknesses. They turned safe routes into dangerous paths. The story of this tank is also a story of industrial strength. The United States produced thousands of Stuarts between 1941 and 1943. Factories worked around the clock. Workers assembled engines, welded armour plates, and tested transmissions. Each finished tank represented manpower, resources, and determination. Once shipped overseas, these machines became part of a global war effort. They supported British forces in Africa. They trained American units preparing for combat. They appeared in multiple theatres, adapting to different environments. In North Africa, the desert shaped everything. The open terrain rewarded speed. The heat tested machinery. Sand challenged every moving part. Yet the Stuart proved capable of handling these conditions better than many expected. The tank's reliability built trust. Crews believed it would start when needed. They believed it would move when ordered. That trust mattered in combat. You can almost imagine a quiet moment at dusk. A Stuart parked behind a ridge, crew members sitting beside it, cleaning sand from their weapons, checking ammunition, sharing a quick meal. The day's fighting behind them. The next mission waiting. The tank standing silent, still warm from the engine, are ready to move again. War rarely gives recognition to machines like this. Heavy tanks capture attention. Big guns dominate headlines. But smaller vehicles often shape the battlefield in quieter ways. The Stuart shaped the desert war through movement, persistence, and presence. It kept pressure on enemy forces. It protected advancing units. It gathered vital information. Rommel's crews, known for their skill and discipline, learned to respect it because they had no choice. They saw what it could do. They experienced its speed. they felt its impact on supply lines and communication. The American tank that once drew laughter had become part of a deadly system, not alone, but connected with infantry, artillery, and air support. A moving piece in a larger strategy. In the end, the Desert Campaign was shaped by many factors. Leadership, supply lines, air power, and industrial strength all played a role. But within that larger story, the small American tank carved out its place. It proved that even a machine designed for support could influence the battlefield. It proved that mobility could challenge heavier forces. It proved that the right tool, used at the right moment, could change everything. The mocking stopped. The reports changed, and across the desert, Rommel's crews learned that the small, fast American tank was not something to ignore. It was a threat that moved like the wind and struck without warning. And for the men inside it, the Stewart was more than steel and machinery. It was survival. It was their shield against gunfire and chaos. It was their chance to return alive after each mission. The Desert War ended, but the legacy of the Stewart remained. It had proven its worth not by overpowering the enemy, but by outmoving, outlasting, and outthinking them. A tank once underestimated had quietly helped shape the outcome of a campaign. Long after the battles ended and the sand settled over abandoned tracks, the story remained. A reminder that in war, it is not always the biggest weapon that makes the difference. Sometimes it is the one that shows up again and again, moving faster, staying longer, and refusing to be ignored. If you want more content like this, subscribe now and comment below.